The town of Cedar Creek carried a calm rhythm that many found comforting. Its streets were lined with modest homes, gardens well kept, and neighbors who waved at each other every morning, as though nothing in the world could disturb the stillness. From the outside it looked like the kind of place where bad things simply did not happen, where danger was something that belonged to faraway cities or late-night news stories. Emily Warren grew up within this quiet bubble, believing it was a safe space where life unfolded without sudden shocks. She was admired for her kind personality and gentle presence, a woman who cared deeply for others, and rarely gave anyone a reason to dislike her. Those who knew her spoke of her kindness and honesty, but what no one realized was that her life was slowly weaving itself into a tragedy that would soon stun the entire community. Emily lived with her mother Margaret, a retired school teacher who was known in town for her intelligence and sharp intuition. Margaret had spent decades shaping young minds, and even in her retirement, people often sought her out for advice or guidance. She had an eye for detail and a memory that missed nothing, qualities that had served her well as a teacher and made her a respected figure in the neighborhood. To those who looked in from the outside, Margaret and Emily's household seemed stable, even ordinary, but underneath the surface, it carried a tension that was quietly building. The reason for this hidden tension had a name: Daniel Pierce. To most of Cedar Creek, Daniel was an admired man, someone who carried himself with charm and confidence. He had a job that gave him a respectable position, and his polished image allowed him to slip into conversations and gatherings with ease. When he first appeared in Emily's life, many thought she was lucky to be with someone so composed and seemingly reliable. But appearances are often misleading, and behind Daniel's outward charm was a man who lived with secrets he was determined to hide at any cost. At the beginning, Emily saw none of this. She fell for the version of Daniel that he wanted her to see: the attentive partner, the man who made her feel safe. But Margaret was not as easily convinced. From the moment she met him, she sensed something carefully hidden beneath his polished exterior. Margaret had always trusted her instincts, and she noticed the subtle changes in his tone, the flickers of impatience in his eyes, the way his stories sometimes shifted when he thought no one was paying attention. To others, these details were invisible, but to Margaret they were warnings. Daniel's double life was not obvious at first. His secret affair was something he managed with caution, relying on discreet phone calls, late-night absences explained away by work, and excuses that seemed believable enough for Emily not to question. Yet secrets leave trails, and no matter how careful he was, there were cracks he could not entirely cover. A misplaced message, a sudden change in his routine, the faint scent of perfume that didn't belong to Emily. All of it accumulated in Margaret's mind, forming a puzzle she could not ignore. Margaret loved her daughter with a fierce protectiveness. She had raised Emily alone for years, guiding her through life with patience and care, and she would not stand by while someone deceived her. Still, she hesitated. She feared that telling Emily too soon would break her heart without giving her the strength to see Daniel for who he truly was. Margaret weighed her options, debating whether silence was kinder than honesty. But with every new sign of Daniel's betrayal, silence became harder to justify. For Daniel, Margaret's watchfulness was more dangerous than Emily's trust. He could continue deceiving Emily as long as she remained blind to the truth. But Margaret was different. She was sharp, determined, and unwilling to look away. He began to sense that she was onto him, that she had noticed far more than she was letting on. It made him restless, filled him with unease. Margaret became in his mind a threat to everything he had worked so hard to conceal. And so, within the walls of an ordinary home in Cedar Creek, the stage for tragedy was set. Margaret's knowledge became the spark that would ignite a violent storm. Emily, unaware of the danger growing around her, continued her days with quiet innocence, while Daniel grew more desperate to keep his double life from unraveling. Margaret's suspicion was no longer just a mother's concern. It was a ticking clock, counting down to the moment when secrets would collide with the need to survive. What no one in Cedar Creek could have predicted was just how far Daniel would be willing to go once he realized Margaret knew too much. Daniel's affair did not begin as something reckless. At first it was hidden in shadows, built on secrecy and small risks that seemed harmless enough to him. He believed he could maintain control, that the two worlds he was living in would never collide. With Emily, he played the role of a devoted partner, attentive and present whenever it suited him. With the other woman, he presented himself as someone misunderstood, a man craving excitement and freedom. He told himself he could handle the weight of both lives, that no one would notice the cracks beginning to spread. But no matter how clever a secret seems, there are always traces left behind. Margaret began noticing those traces before anyone else. It was not a single discovery that opened her eyes, but rather a collection of small inconsistencies. Daniel would tell Emily he was working late, yet Margaret saw his car parked blocks away from the house on nights when he was supposedly at the office. He claimed exhaustion from long hours, but his shirts sometimes carried faint scents that didn't match Emily's perfume. He grew distracted during conversations, his phone always nearby, his attention often elsewhere. These details might have escaped Emily, who was blinded by affection, but to Margaret, they formed a pattern too obvious to dismiss. The moment that cemented Margaret's suspicions came when she found a receipt tucked inside the pocket of Daniel's jacket. It was for a dinner at a restaurant far from Cedar Creek, dated on a night he had sworn he was in meetings. Margaret said nothing immediately, but her silence was not acceptance, it was observation. She understood that confronting him without certainty would only create tension. So instead, she kept watching, collecting the pieces of truth like fragments of glass scattered across a floor. Margaret wrestled with the burden of what she knew. As a mother, her instinct was to protect Emily from harm, and yet she understood the pain such knowledge would bring. To tell Emily outright would mean shattering her trust, pulling her into a storm she might not be ready to face. At the same time, silence weighed heavily on Margaret's conscience. She could not stand by while Daniel continued weaving lies around her daughter. The choice felt impossible: protect Emily's heart in the short term, or protect her future from a man who was already showing signs of betrayal. While Margaret debated her next step, Daniel began to sense her scrutiny. He could feel her eyes on him whenever he visited the house. She asked quiet questions, seemingly casual, but Daniel recognized their edge. She lingered in rooms longer than necessary, listening, paying attention. He grew uneasy whenever he was near her, convinced she had begun piecing together the parts of his life he worked hardest to hide. And in his mind, Margaret's suspicion was not merely a threat, it was a danger that could ruin everything. The other woman in Daniel's life was unaware of the risk he was taking. She believed his promises, accepted his excuses, and trusted that his relationship with Emily was crumbling. She did not know that Daniel had no intention of leaving Emily, nor did she realize the lengths he would go to protect the image he had built in Cedar Creek. For Daniel, the affair was not about love, but about ego, about the thrill of living two lives without consequence. He never imagined that consequence could take the shape of Margaret's sharp perception. As weeks passed, Margaret's silence grew heavier. She noticed Emily beginning to doubt small things, moments when Daniel's words didn't add up, but Emily quickly brushed them aside. Margaret's heart ached to tell her the full truth, yet she also feared how Daniel might react. She had lived long enough to recognize the kind of man who would not handle exposure well. The tension in the Warren household thickened, invisible to outsiders, but heavy to those inside. What seemed like a peaceful home to neighbors was, in reality, a fragile space where suspicion and secrecy pressed against each other with growing force. Daniel, in his desperation, started to prepare for possibilities Margaret hadn't even considered. He knew she was close to saying something, and he convinced himself that once she opened her mouth, his carefully managed world would collapse. He told himself that Margaret wasn't just a mother protecting her daughter. She was an obstacle standing between him and the life he wanted to maintain. And in the dark corners of his mind where charm and lies no longer mattered, Daniel began to believe that silencing her would be the only way to secure his secret. What Margaret saw as her responsibility as a mother, Daniel viewed as a threat to his control. Her silence was running out, and his patience was wearing thin. Both were locked in a quiet battle. Neither spoke of openly, but one that was steadily pulling them toward an irreversible conclusion. The affair, once hidden behind closed doors and whispered promises, was no longer just a betrayal. It was becoming the fuse to a tragedy waiting to ignite. The moment Daniel realized Margaret would not remain silent marked a shift in his thoughts from unease to calculation. He had lived for months in the belief that he could outwit suspicion, that his lies and charm would always keep people in line, but Margaret was different. She was steady, patient, and unafraid to look directly at what others tried to ignore. Daniel could sense it in her expressions and in the way her questions lingered. She no longer carried the uncertain curiosity of someone guessing at the truth. She carried the certainty of someone who had already seen it. For Daniel, that was more than unsettling. It was dangerous. He began to imagine the consequences. If Margaret spoke openly, Emily's faith in him would collapse, and the affair would no longer be a hidden indulgence. The other woman would realize the promises he made to her were lies, and the carefully crafted image he presented in Cedar Creek would crumble. He told himself that he had worked too hard to build this life to let a single person destroy it. Margaret's presence in his life was no longer that of a mother-in-law figure. She was, in his eyes, a barrier that threatened to strip away his control. The idea of removing her began as a fleeting thought, a whisper he quickly dismissed. But whispers, once entertained, have a way of returning louder each time. Daniel's mind replayed scenarios of what would happen if Margaret confronted Emily. He pictured Emily walking away from him, the town whispering about his betrayal, and the other woman abandoning him in disappointment. Each time these thoughts circled, the solution he once considered unthinkable began to seem inevitable. He convinced himself that Margaret left him with no choice. His reasoning grew darker as he worked through the logistics of what he was planning. Margaret could not be targeted without raising questions. If something happened to her alone, Emily would never stop searching for answers. She was devoted to her mother, and her suspicion would fall on him no matter how well he tried to conceal it. Daniel told himself that if he was going to act, he would have to eliminate them both. It was a decision born not of sudden rage but of cold calculation, built on the idea that silence could only be secured if both voices were gone. Once the decision took hold, Daniel's behavior shifted. Outwardly, he remained calm and composed, still showing up at Emily's door with the same charm that once fooled her. Inwardly, however, he was plotting. He thought about timing, about how he could make the act look like something else entirely. He studied the house with careful eyes, noting the locks, the windows, and the patterns of Margaret and Emily's nightly routines. His plan was not impulsive, but methodical. He imagined staging the scene to resemble a burglary, creating the illusion of chaos rather than intention. Every detail became part of his preparation. He noticed how Margaret often read in the living room after dinner, usually until late, while Emily settled upstairs earlier in the night. He knew which doors creaked when opened, and which could be pushed quietly. He considered what to scatter, what to break, how to move things in a way that would tell investigators a story he had invented. Daniel's thoughts no longer revolved around whether he would commit the crime but how he would execute it. Margaret, unaware of just how far his mind had drifted, continued to weigh her options. She thought she had time, that she could choose the right moment to tell Emily the truth. She did not realize that her silence was already too late, that Daniel's paranoia had escalated beyond repair. She was still a mother protecting her daughter, unaware that her watchful care had transformed into a reason for her own end. As the summer days grew longer, the tension in Daniel's chest hardened into resolve. He rehearsed the crime in his imagination, convincing himself he could walk away from it untouched. He told himself that once it was done, his life would return to order, that he could mourn with the town while secretly carrying the relief of having erased the one person who threatened him. Emily, in his mind, was simply collateral damage, an unavoidable consequence of the situation Margaret had forced upon him. He twisted the truth until he believed it, that he was not choosing violence, but defending the life he had built from destruction. The plans were in place, the excuses ready, the story rehearsed. What remained was only the act itself, and in Daniel's mind, it was no longer a matter of possibility, It was a matter of timing. He had convinced himself that the storm was inevitable, and soon the house that had always felt safe to Margaret and Emily would become the stage for a crime so carefully staged, it would stun Cedar Creek. The night Daniel chose was one that seemed unremarkable to anyone else. The air was still. The streets of Cedar Creek lay quiet under the glow of soft streetlights, and most homes had already gone dark for the evening. Inside the Warren house, Margaret followed her familiar routine. After dinner, she settled in the living room with a book, her glasses perched low on her nose, the steady lamp beside her casting a warm glow. Emily upstairs prepared for bed, brushing her hair in front of the mirror, and folding clothes with the calmness of someone who felt safe in the life she believed she was living. It was a night like countless others before it, which made what was about to happen all the more chilling. Daniel had prepared himself with precision. He knew the rhythms of the house, the patterns of its occupants, and the details that would allow him to move without raising alarm. He parked his car farther from the house than usual, leaving it in shadow so that no curious neighbor might notice it sitting too close. His steps toward the house were slow, measured, each one carrying the weight of the decision he had already made. He had convinced himself this was the only way forward, that this was the price of keeping his secret affair hidden. The thought was no longer shocking to him. It had become routine in his mind, as though the act of planning had numbed him to the horror of what he was about to do. The door gave way with a faint click, one he had tested before. He stepped inside, greeted not by alarms or barking dogs, but by the silence of a trusting home. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock were the only sounds that met him. He moved carefully through the familiar space, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, his ears tuned to every creak of the floorboards. Margaret sat unaware in the living room, her attention fixed on the pages before her. The lamplight threw shadows across the room, shadows that shifted as Daniel drew nearer. She didn't even look up in time to realize he was there. The act was quick, brutal, and deliberate. For Margaret, there was no chance to resist or cry out for help. In one cruel moment, her sharp intuition, her steady watchfulness, and her silent suspicions were extinguished. The book slipped from her hands and lay open on the floor, a final mark of the quiet life she had led. The sound of struggle carried faintly upstairs, just enough for Emily to hear. She paused, uncertain at first, then hurried down the stairs to find out what had happened. Her footsteps, light and hurried, became the signal Daniel had been waiting for. She appeared at the bottom of the staircase and froze as the scene revealed itself before her eyes. The sight of her mother was enough to send a wave of horror through her, but she had no time to process it. Daniel, already consumed by his plan, acted before she could scream. Her shock and confusion left her defenseless. What followed was as swift as it was merciless, the destruction of a life that had trusted him completely. When the house finally fell silent again, 2 lives had been erased. The only sounds left were the ticking clock and the faint rustle of leaves outside, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Daniel, breathing heavily but composed, turned his attention to the second part of his plan. The deaths themselves were not enough. He needed to craft a story that would shield him from suspicion. He overturned a chair, scattered belongings from a drawer onto the floor, and pulled objects from shelves as though a desperate thief had rushed through the house. He broke a window near the back door, careful to make the damage look convincing. To the untrained eye it would appear to be the work of an intruder, a crime of chance rather than one of intent. He studied the room with the cold detachment of someone assessing his own work. It was not grief that filled him, but calculation. He wiped surfaces where he thought he might have left traces, shifted items to create disorder, and finally stood in the center of the chaos, satisfied that the picture told the story he wanted it to tell. To anyone who discovered the scene, it would look like a robbery interrupted, a tragic accident in which mother and daughter had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Outside, the town of Cedar Creek remained oblivious. Lights flickered in neighboring houses, where families slept soundly, unaware of the horror that had unfolded only a few steps away. The quiet streets carried no hint of violence, no sign of the storm that had broken within one family's walls. Daniel slipped back into the night as carefully as he had entered, his steps steady, his face expressionless. To anyone who might see him, he would look like nothing more than a man walking in the late hours of the evening. By the time the bodies would be discovered, the crime scene would already be shaped by Daniel's hand. To neighbors and investigators alike, it would look like tragedy born of misfortune. Only Daniel knew the truth, that it had been built, not out of rage or impulse, but out of cold determination to bury a secret that he refused to let surface. The deaths of Margaret and Emily Warren shook Cedar Creek in ways the small town had never experienced before. News of the discovery spread quickly, first whispered among neighbors, then announced across radios and television screens. A mother and daughter gone in one night, their home left in disarray, their lives cut short in what looked like a burglary that spiraled into violence. Friends and neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, standing in stunned silence as police officers moved in and out of the Warren home. For a community so untouched by violent crime, the scene felt unreal, like a nightmare that had broken into their carefully kept lives. Daniel was there among the mourners, his face carrying the mask of grief he had rehearsed. He walked with slow, heavy steps, spoke in hushed tones about how unfair it all was, and accepted condolences with downcast eyes. To those who saw him, he appeared devastated, a man who had lost both a partner and her mother in one senseless act. His performance was convincing enough that, at first, no one questioned his sorrow, but while the town grieved sincerely, Daniel's grief was only a tool, another layer of his deception. Investigators, however, were trained to look beyond appearances. From the beginning, something about the crime scene troubled them. The house was certainly staged to appear ransacked, but the staging felt too deliberate. Items of value remained untouched, while drawers had been emptied haphazardly. A chair was overturned in a way that seemed unnatural, as though it had been placed rather than knocked. The window at the back of the house was broken, but glass lay outside rather than inside, a detail suggesting the break had been staged. To an untrained eye, it looked like chaos. To investigators, it looked like someone's version of chaos carefully arranged. As police began piecing together a timeline, Daniel's name inevitably rose to the surface. He had been close to the victims, spending countless hours in the Warren home, and he had reason to know their routines. His alibi was checked, and though he claimed to have been elsewhere at the time, small inconsistencies appeared. His phone records showed gaps he could not account for. Surveillance footage from nearby streets revealed a car resembling his parked blocks away on the night of the murders. The carefully woven fabric of his lies began to fray under scrutiny. The most damning thread came from the affair he had killed to protect. The woman Daniel had been secretly seeing was questioned by investigators after his name surfaced in connection to the case. At first, she hesitated, unwilling to expose the details of their relationship, but the weight of the investigation pushed her toward honesty. She admitted to the affair, revealed the messages he had sent, and handed over records that contradicted his claims about his whereabouts. What Daniel had believed was his greatest secret became the very thing that exposed his guilt. As evidence mounted, Daniel's calm exterior began to crack. Friends noticed him becoming withdrawn, avoiding conversations he once engaged in easily. He no longer played the role of the grieving partner with the same conviction. Investigators returned to him again and again, pressing on the holes in his story, showing him the growing mountain of evidence. Each time, his answers grew less certain, his explanations less believable. When the arrest finally came, the town of Cedar Creek watched in disbelief. The man they had seen mourning at vigils, the man who had spoken of loss and heartbreak, was led away in handcuffs. For many, the revelation was more shocking than the crime itself, that someone so close to the victims, someone who had stood in their living room countless times, was the very person responsible for their deaths. It was betrayal on every level, not only of Emily's trust, but of the entire community's belief in who Daniel was. In court, the story unfolded piece by piece. The staged break-in, the inconsistencies in his alibi, the testimony of his secret lover, all painted a picture too clear to deny. Prosecutors described the crime as cold, calculated, and fueled by desperation to hide a truth that Margaret had uncovered. The jury listened to the details, the evidence, the motives, and when the verdict came, there was little surprise. Daniel Pierce was found guilty on all counts. His double life revealed not only to Emily's memory, but to the world he had tried so carefully to deceive. For Cedar Creek, healing was slow. The Warren home remained a reminder of the night when violence broke through the town's peace. Neighbors placed flowers at the gate, children asked questions their parents struggled to answer, and Margaret and Emily were remembered not for the way their lives ended, but for the kindness they had given while alive. The town carried their memory as a lesson about the darkness that can hide behind charm, and about how even the quietest suspicions, like Margaret's, can hold the weight of truth. Daniel's attempt to erase his secret had failed in the most complete way possible. The very act of silencing those who knew too much ensured that everyone would eventually know everything. In trying to bury the truth, he unearthed it for all to see, leaving behind a legacy not of success or respect, but of betrayal, cowardice, and the destruction of two innocent lives.